Okay, so we'll get started. By way of introduction, the fable of the fabulous philosopher. There was once a child who was bitten by a sphinx, and so, as he grew, was consumed by a search for the wisdom of animals. Every time he encountered an ant or a lion, he asked them, "Do you exist and matter in and for yourselves, or are you just constructs of humanity?" But they only turned their backs to him, so stupid were his questions. So despite his best instincts, he went to the university, but was so befuddled by the screeching professors and students that he ran away and found the squeaking rats in the laboratory. He shared his lunch with them, and they told about a wise woman who had visited their maze once and surpassed the expectations of both the experimenters and the rats. "Seek her among the birds," they chirped. So the sphinx-bitten boy travelled to the desert where he found the dancing babblers. But before he could ask them the whereabouts of the fabulous philosopher ethologist, they interrupted him. "A fable is supposed to be short," they sang, "not to mention an introduction. Nobody has time for your quest through the whole menagerie. We'll just give you her address." And they airdropped him the link for a conference in Canterbury. "Now come," they said, "dance with us a while, then we'll send you on your way. This is how you will recognize her. Like the cunning rat, she cannot be contained by futile traps. Like the clever horse, she perceives things others fail to notice. Like the social sheep, she has quite a few opinions. And like us dancing babblers, she knows how to enjoy herself. Indeed, like all the world-surprising creatures, she is gifted with a fierce intelligence in search of better questions and stories." So, friends and colleagues, I give you Vinciane Despret.
Mostly friend. Thank you so much, Matthew. Bruno Latour, in the preface, he kindly offered to the translation of what would animals say if we ask the right question, chose to give the title "The Scientific Fables of an Empirical La Fontaine." First of all, they are fables, since Latour mentions that each of the book chapters introduces a new genre of narrative, that is, that of scientific fables. As for La Fontaine, he appears twice in Latour's text. On the one hand, he says, La Fontaine's fable, like these scientific fables, and with a moral, although the modes differ. On the other hand, if these are indeed a genre of fables similar to those of La Fontaine, Latour says, they will nonetheless be those of an empirical La Fontaine. Indeed, Latour writes that the stories in these scientific fables are not based, as in La Fontaine's case, on millennia-old folklore, but on, I quote him, a specific body of scientific and ethnographic literature about one or several animals' encounters. In other words, it's not about fiction or false stories, but rather, I quote Latour again, on contrary, true ways of understanding how difficult it is to figure out what animals are up to. Latour emphasizes with this last formulation not so much the truth or falsehood of the stories, but the difficulties faced by researchers trying to understand what animals are doing. This leads him to revisit the label empiricist, creating a contrast that, at first glance, might seem to no longer concern La Fontaine. I say at first glance because I believe we could revisit this contrast by clarifying it. The contrast is simple. When we talk about empiricism, under the same term, we are actually referring to two very different epistemic currents. This is, there is, according to Latour, a first form of empiricism which he proposes to qualify as subtractive. This way of getting to know characterized a large number of scientists who proceed by exclusion. I quote Latour, "Most scientists, when faced with alternative accounts, will try to distance themselves from all of them, to start from scratch and to mimic as exactly as possible what their fellow scientists in neighboring fields have done with physical objects and chemical reaction. Whatever, still Latour, whatever ordinary people, pet owners, breeders, conservationists, and TV documentarians have said will be pushed aside as so many mere anecdotes." What the scientists aim to do is to speak about the animal themselves. Hence, a whole process of purification, control, and distancing. Of course, this is far from La Fontaine with this kind of empiricism, and I will say this quickly and try to develop it later. If there is something particular about La Fontaine's fable with animals, is that we never quite know who or what we are dealing with, at least never in a clear way with the animals themselves. But this empiricism, says Latour, gives rise to a strange paradox. I quote him, what is it? Why is it that scientific knowledge about animals should be created under such artificial conditions, he means laboratory, to get rid of all the equally artificial situation in which humans encounter animals? Now, Latour notes that this desire to get rid of interaction, considered to be so many temptations to anthropomorphism, characterizes a particular operation, that of subtraction. Hence the term subtractive empiricism. The subtractive empiricist strives to, I quote Latour, decrease the number of alternatives and to limit the number of voices claiming to participate in the conversation. This reductionist approach will be opposed, this reductionist will is opposed to another form of empiricism, the second one that can be found among some researchers, among 19th century naturalists, and is still present among many people who work and live with animals. Latour proposes to call it additive empiricism. With this term, he means to indicate that, unlike the first, it is not about subtracting, but about adding. To add means, in that case, to complicate, to specify, and above all, to hesitate before excluding. So, as Latour writes, as to multiply the voices that can be heard. Above all, to hesitate before excluding. This hesitation, says Latour, is particularly and concretely apparent when it comes to determining how to ascribe agency to humans as well as to animals. And because of these hesitations, says Latour, you move from the question of anthropomorphism to the much more interesting one of metamorphosis, by which, Latour writes, by which I mean not only to polize the boundary between what is human and what is animal, a limited question if ever there was one, but to explore the protean nature of what it means to be animated. Latour writes, scientists, breeders, animal lovers, pet owners, zookeepers, meat eaters, we are constantly trying to avoid de-animating or over-animating those beings with whom we constantly change shapes. Latour precising shape changing being the English equivalent of metamorphosis. I don't know whether Latour had in mind to reinforce the analogy with La Fontaine by insisting on the question of metamorphosis. And I don't know whether he was aware of the work that Michel Serres had done on this question. Although Serres' book was not published until 5 years after this preface I was mentioning, it is also true that Serres had already begun this long work in the mid-90s. In his lecture at Stanford, we find notes in which he indicates his interest in the fables, and in 1994 and in 1997, he begins his lecture, still in Stanford, by mentioning possible titles for a book he was planning to write on La Fontaine's fable. He didn't write it, but this book has been done since that, collecting all the papers people could find. Jean-Charles Darmon did that, and he did a very nice job. In any case, Latour's assertion that animals are those, I quote him again, with whom we constantly change shapes, seems to me to capture an intuition that Serres would develop in relation to La Fontaine's fable. They are agents of metamorphosis. The fables are agents of metamorphosis. And my intuition of a possible proximity is confirmed when I read that the last lines of Latour's text on scientific fables, this is it, deprived of the attention given to them by other companion species, humans have lost the ability to behave like humans. If I go back to Serres, this would be exactly where fables can still play a role. They can shape the animal habits that make us human. To borrow from the beautiful title of Deborah Birdsrow's book about dingoes and their human companions, are we saying that animals make us human? And if they cannot do in our real life, they can still do through our stories. The philosopher Barbara used it to say that you only really know your language when you speak another one. Could we then say that we can only know what we are as humans, as human animals, by learning it alongside other non-human animals? This is a risky statement, and I should rephrase it. Because let us not forget, human exceptionalism is based on animals, we could also say, or we should say, on their back, to define difference, or rather the difference. My initial proposal could well cover this case. Indeed, to affirm the uniqueness of man, of human, we have defined our specificity, in this case, our supposed exceptional nature, certainly by comparing ourselves to other animals, but also and above all, by seeking not only for what we have in addition to them, but also and especially for what they lack. In this way, we are able to completely deanimate everything that lived and shared the world with us. You know, the tragic aftermath of the story. And the fact that, as Latour pointed out, we have lost something of our humanity, or more precisely, and I believe more rightly, the ability to behave like humans. Instead of this overly risky proposition that we can only learn about ourselves as human animals by learning from other animals, we can substitute this other proposition, which is paradoxically both more cautious and much more generous. I would say that we can only become human animals by becoming them with other animals. And according to Michel Serres, this is the challenge of La Fontaine's fable. It's not about knowing what we are, it is about learning to become it. And in this specific case of multiple interspecific becomings on an interspecies mode, what is at stake is metamorphosis. It's a truism to say so, but many authors agree that the fables present a paradox. To take the simplest definition of fables, they are short stories. Thank you, Kaori, to remind me when we first talked, that often feature animals and end with a moral. The paradox is that the animals speak and act like humans. Why ask animals to play a role that turns out to be a human role? I set aside political explanation, which suggests, and we have mentioned it, which suggests that animals serve as a straw man, allowing the author of these stories to escape potential censorship. A hypothesis that is all the more plausible given that many fables deal with issues of power, relationship between aristocracy and the bourgeoisie, tyranny, injustice, parasitism, and many other concerns. Other authors before Serres have addressed this and have done so in a very interesting ways. Serres interprets the fables quite differently. He starts from the idea that if we still like them so much today, if we still know them, if we recite them so happily, if they are still part of the cultural repertoire of almost all of us, it's because they do something to us, or more precisely, it's because they make us do things. Animals are the main characters here. Why them, if we set aside the question of an author's ruse with the censors? Serres reminds us that in the preface to his fables, La Fontaine talks about the effect of the stories with animals. And he quotes La Fontaine. Tell a child that Croesus, going against the Parthians, engaged in dayland without considering how he would get out, and that this lad is, and his army don't fall. Or tell him that fox and goat went down to the bottom of a well to quench their thirst, and that fox convinced goat to let him climb on his shoulder to get out, and then calmly abandoned him to his fate. I wonder, says La Fontaine, which of these two examples will make the most impression on this child. Michel Serres comments in response to La Fontaine's rhetorical question, we will choose, whether young or old, the second story, because we are all, we live and we think from our earliest childhood closer to animals than to humans. And Serres continues, I quote him, even in the most urban environment hostile to the living beings, children play with plush bears and foxes. And further, he says, even separated as we are now from the living, vegetal or beastly world, this knowledge that we inherit from our more distant ancestor remains, and its long-term stability allows us to understand, as we were there, the fables. But more than that, the animals in the fables speak. There is the paradox again. Are they humans in animal clothing or humanized animals? And what if, as Serres suggests, rather than seeing a representation of the human, we were to focus on the speaking? In a very fine passage, he writes, I quote him, "The rare but profound connivance with animals that stable boys know better than I do made me remember forgotten totemism or true meaning of the fables. One morning, an old man said to the sea lion, who answered. The oak one day said to the reed. The dew therefore said to the passerby. How else can we express other than through the metaphorical narrative of saying this message that is exchanged from species to species without grammar or lexicon between two bodies that cross a distance measured neither by time nor space, but suddenly beyond these obstacles, pathetically attuned. Pathetically attuned by the metaphor of saying, of speaking. I believe that this pathetically should be understood in its literal sense. It's a question of pathos, of feeling together, of an emotion or an affect that forms a community. This is what a common language can produce, the possibility of a common affect, a connivance that is inscribed metaphorically in the register of saying. And what if the speech of the animals in these fables, this metaphorical speech, were simply an account of fundamental complicity between all beings who have never stopped communicating since the dawn of their existence? Serres, in the natural contract, has already raised the question of saying and speaking. I quote him in the natural contract, page 306 in the French version. We have imagined that we could live and think among ourselves while obedient things slept, all crushed under our sway. In what language do the things of the world speak so that we can get along with them by contract? But after all, still Serres, but after all, the old contract too remained unspoken and unwritten. No one has ever read either the original or even a copy. Of course, we don't know the language of the world, or we only know the various animistic religions or mathematical version of it. In fact, Serres concludes, the earth speaks to us in terms of forces, links, and interaction, and that is enough to make a contract. Each of the partners in the symbiosis there is by right owed life to the other under the penalty of death. Serres would later return to the question of language, but this time in the context of writing, in his book Darwin, Bonaparte et le Samaritain, Une philosophie de l'histoire. Serres claims that reading is not limited to the codes of writing as we usually understand it, which is what good hunters know, he adds, able to read in the tracks left by a boar, its age, sex, weight, age, and 1,000 of other details. I quote, "The good hunter reads after learning to read. What does he decipher? A code, coded in print." This definition can be taken to characterize historical human writing itself. Because, Serres continue, writing is the threat of all beings, living and non-living, all of whom write on think and among themselves the things of the world on one another. Saying and writing oneself, making known, making felt, declaring. This word is silent only for those who wanted to silence it. Other living beings, and the research, for example, if you know it, or if you know them, of bioacoustician Bernie Krause, has provided 1,000 of proof of this. The world, the living beings of the world, never stop listening to each other. So the animals speak in the fables. Let's go back to the fables. But that doesn't make them human in disguise. All we can say is that the otherness as animals is blurred. They are both animal and human, and we become human with them. What fables not only tell, but propose and even perform are metamorphoses. This means that Michel Serres' analysis and reading of the fables will focus on the effect. Let's take a clear example given by Jean-Charles Darmon commenting on Serres. 5-year-old Nicholas, to understand what I will tell now, you all have to remind the fables of the crow and the fox. Do you remember the crow and the fox and the cheese? Everybody knows it? Okay. 5-year-old Nicholas received a piece of cheese from his father for dessert. He picks it up and drops it on the floor. The father picks it up and puts it back on the plate. The child picks it up again and hop on the floor. The third time, the father, she's very nice. Yes, third time, asked to Nicolas, "What are you doing, Nicolas?" And Nicolas, the child, replied, "I am dropping my prey." This translation might be not familiar for you because I've been checking. This is the translation of Nicolas saying, because in French, the fables say, "Le corbeau laisse tomber sa proie," drop his prey. But all the translation I found from the fables, no one said that, either for poetic reason, for rhymes, either for other reason, but the cheese fall, but the prey is never mentioned, So just what I was saying, that Nicolas was playing with his cheese and his body, a sentence that he knew by heart, and that all children in France and in Belgium know by heart. Et il laisse tomber sa proie. Pour faire entendre sa belle voix, le corbeau laisse tomber sa proie. I'm dropping my prey. The child has become the crow from the fable, The Crow and the Fox. This is one of the first effects of the fable, which the child obviously knows by heart, or rather, as Serres would say, knows by body. The fables induce a form of mimicry. At the start of the courses he gave in 1994 in Stanford, Serres was already amazed by the longevity of the fables in our tradition. This is clearly demonstrated by little Nicolas of the 21st century with his cheese. But what Nicolas' mischievous gesture above all testified to is, and I quote Serres now, is that the fables correspond to the major mode of transmission of knowledge in young and old alike, imitation. We communicate with others, experience feelings, speak, end up knowing, and sometimes inventing because we mime. We act as if. just like the monkey, and better than him, we imitate the rat, the cat, the wolf, the pot, the milk woman was bringing to the market, the oak or the reed, the miser, the judge, the cobbler, and so on and so on. This is the ethological basis of the fables, Serres says. Since, I quote him, this fox, this stork, this golden eagle also serve as totems for stranger and more distant population, which, thanks to the fables, suddenly seem to us to be neighbors and brothers. Do they also imitate things, plants or beasts, in order to learn from them the knowledge that is essential to survival? In his 1994 lecture, Serres talks about the fact that this imitation, this mimesis of a properly totemic order, has a very utilitarian, very biological perspective, survival. In relation to this first proposition, I think I find a slight inflection that transformed it in later writings. The fables, Serres writes, shape the origin of human being, but not an origin that detaches him from what precede him, but on the contrary, an origin that offers him, human being, or them, I should say them in this case, a link with the animals. It is with them that we became human, fully human. That is with them that we become human, fully human. To ask the question of origin through the fable is not, therefore, to ask how the beast remained silent, but rather how speech came to the beast and made them humans. The aim is not to create a contrast between silent beasts and talkative humans, but to explore how, I could say, how animality still speaks within us, how our beastly bodies still speak, and by starting to speak, are transformed into human beings. This propensity to imitate animals, on which the effectiveness of the fables hinges, the idea that in the fables we find the body of a beast that still speaks, as Serres says, belongs to the same ontology, even if Serres doesn't use the term in this context, that of a possible participation, in short, that of totemism. Serres insists, from the speaking bodies, animals teach us that we are not as far removed from totems and fetishes as we think. I can't help but think, upon reading Serres' double proposition, when he affirms that fables make us into totemic beings, and that they reenact the story through which speech came to animals and made them into humans, something the Aborigines old team told to Deborah Burrose. The stories featuring dingoes, says Deborah Burrose, encourage human participation. But in doing so, they imply that we have, as humans, a propensity for isolation. Old Tim told her that when dingoes are in the bush, they speak and walk like humans. However, when humans are nearby, they revert to the form and language of dingoes. On the other hand, the other animals, except humans, know exactly what's going on, and the dingoes don't take the same precaution with them. The story of dingoes, endowed with human speech and attitude, she explained, is consistent with the Dreamtime stories where, originally, all the creatures had human form and spoke human languages. But, she continues, a form of stabilization abruptly halted all the creature in their tracks, in the forms and cries we recognize today. What is disconcerting in this story, Rose note, is that here, with the case of dingoes hiding the humanity from humans, we witness a strange form of exceptionalism, an inverted exceptionalism. In all team stories, the human difference lies in the fact that we, and only we, are incapable of perceiving the metamorphosis of dingoes. Reflecting on what Rose writes about stories encouraging participation and, in a way, counteracting the human tendency toward isolation, I think we could, as Serres briefly does, take into account the era in which La Fontaine was writing. There is a world that is passing away in La Fontaine's time. Modernity shows the first signs of all future separation, of all the detachments that will rapidly transform the world. Caroline Merkin wrote a brilliant book about, the death of nature, about that. Michel Serres reminds us that La Fontaine's fables were written at the time when knowledge was being transformed, when, I quote him, archaic knowledge shifts into taxonomy, and when a new relationship with living beings was establishing itself. La Fontaine was well aware of it. It suffices to read the beautiful, the wonderful letter he addressed to Madame de la Sablière, where he protests against Descartes and his animals machine. This is such a beautiful letter. La Fontaine saw the world being transformed, just as he could not help but see, I quote now Serres, that zoo and plant gardens were replacing the stables and fields of the farm. You don't live, work, think, or speak there as you do here, because in order to observe, as the new scientists do, I added, one must feel not involved. Hence, a definitive separation and detachment. Am I projecting my concern? Am I not over-interpreting in the life of what Latour tells about this impoverishing empiricism, which convinces itself that truth can only be obtained at the price of a dramatic detachment? Could we not think that La Fontaine foresaw the solitude that was about to set in, and that in reading Descartes, he could imagine what was being lost in the relationship they were being forged with other living beings? That these new visions of animals should lead not only to the exclusion from our once shared world, but was also leading to our exclusion from this world. In this time of change, Serres writes, the fable bears witness to the old world where life formed a universe of correspondence. What was being lost was the connivence that binds the living together. End of quote. If I now turn to Michel Foucault's book, The Order of Things, what is disappearing at this moment in history is this very connection. What Serres calls connivence, complicité in French, or connivence. No, it says connivence, excuse me. I found some feature of it in Foucault's description of conveniencia, which played a central role in analogical thought until modernity. I quote Michel Foucault, "Things are convenient when they approach each other and come to touch. Through this, movement is communicated, influences and patience as well as properties. In the vast syntax of the world, different beings adjust to one another. The plant communicates with the animal, the earth with the sea, man with everything around him." Back to Serres, the fable create connivence, or perhaps they rekindle it. And they do so primarily by proposing, as I have already mentioned, to mimic otherness, dropping the cheese like little Nicola, being afraid of the wolf like the lamb, thinking like the cicada, running slowly like the tortoise. These mimic proposals, Serres adds, are at the heart of metamorphosis. Fables, in fact, simulate simulation. And that's how they offer us what Latour called shape changes. Fables do so, Serres adds, by working on bodies. First, there is a recurring characteristic of the fables. They depict posture. The crow is above the fox, perhaps on his tree. The fox is above the goat at his shoulder. In the well, the wolf with the wolf is upstream, the lamb downstream. There, I could add. There is a geography or topography of postures, a body language articulated through preposition, with, in front of, above, beside, before, after, in front of, behind, and so on and so on. More precisely still, Serres states, the position of bodies encode prepositions. Or even more concretely, the body records the memory of position. Prepositions are learning through the body. The message of the fable is a message before language, preserved in the body's memory. A fable, says Serres, is then a palimpsest, not only because it feeds on the myths and fables that preceded it, but because it is first read on our bodies. Learning by heart, as we've already mentioned, becomes clearer. It's learning through the body. Every animal or human gestures calls for mime, or to speak in the language of totemic people, for mimetic participation. Participation through the body that mimics responding to the mimetic call through gesture and posture. That carve pathways, is Serres talking, that carve pathway into our cognitive connection so that they remain in the body. Just an answer to Povinelli yesterday, it's his own talks. So it's a whole process of transforming bodies. And on this subject, I will have a beautiful paper by Erika Fuchs. Thank you, Erika, who asked why the biography of Aesop, the life of Aesop, is so frequent in the collection of fables found in the 16th century and 17th century, knowing that Aesop fables, she suggests, were central to the humanist education system of the early modern period. That is, it was at the heart of the process that was meant to produce the most human of humans. End of quote. She also raises the paradox that Serres is trying to resolve, namely that, I quote again Erika, It may seem ironic, to say the least, that beasts should teach humans how to become fully human. But, Erika adds, a way of understanding this paradox can be found in an anecdote told in the beginning of the life of Aesop. Aesop, she remarks, is depicted as mute, and later on he will be stammering, deformed, and foul, and he can barely be regarded as being properly human. Aesop, as has been reminded this afternoon, is a slave and is sent to work in the fields to dig and delve the earth. Fuchs precises. He is not of the house, but of the land, more like a beast than a man. It is, Fuchs adds, this apparent lack of qualities that are deemed to be human by the world he lives in that provide the very foundation for his status as speaker of the moral truth and writer of tales inhabited by beasts. But it is by an incident, one could say a founding one, that Aesop will be restored to humanity. And this connection to humanity rests on a bodily characteristic, his stomach. This anecdote tells that Aesop master, visiting the field, asked his slave to bring him a plate of figs. Agathopus, one of these slaves, is tasked with this, but he does not bring them back, and with another slave, he eats them. Both accuse Aesop. Since Aesop cannot speak, he is mute, he cannot defend himself, and must be stripped and beaten, like an animal. But Aesop possesses the knowledge of beasts, and with signs, he signals his master to bring him a large amount of hot water. He drinks it, put the finger in his mouth, and vomit. His stomach is empty. The belly cannot lie. The two culprits must do the same, which reveals both their guilt and their lie. Fuchs comments, I quote, "The belly can make meaning. They have forgotten, in short, that they have forgotten, in short, they being simultaneously in possession of and possessed by their stomach. Aesop, on the other hand, knows this. He has accepted his beastly status. It is through his body, or more precisely, his bodily powers, that Aesop retains his humanity. That is, the fact that he remains dressed, is not beaten, and, above all, is able not only to tell the truth, but to impose it. In short, Aesop combines both his animality, in the fact that he speaks with an animal bodily gesture, and his humanity. Erika Fuchs concludes, the biography of Aesop introduced the beast fables in a way that suggests that readers might encounter them as a mean by which to revisit their own status. It opens up for scrutiny the relationship between reason and corporality in a way that does not reject, veil, or dismiss that relationship. Rather, it acknowledges and engages the body power. Serres himself has commented on this incident. If Aesop's wisdom has been so highly praised, it is because he regarded the whole body as the key to all knowledge. I quote Serres now, because he discovered and embodied from the very beginning the pedagogy by imitation, the acquisition of all knowledge and practice through transforming one's body into a being other than oneself. Because of the invention of these short, laconic stories, where animals speak to each other, reproduce this initiatory mime of bodies. What does it mean to become a beast through the fables? According to Serres, it means being deliberate to one's dominant passion. We humans are, he says, despecialized, de-differentiated. We are, in a way, all animals at once, but we know no specialization. I quote him, "We do not enjoy a claw that tears or a pair of pliers that squeeze, but a hand that can be used for anything while serving nothing until it has learned." Life has de-differentiated us. In other words, our totemic desire for participation with a chosen animal actually reflects a longing to return to a form of stability, a stabilization that the Aborigines intuitively believe occurred in green time, and that would have fixed each animal in its form, in its gesture, its cry, I would add, in its specific powers. Our desire to be an animal to which the fables respond is a desire to return to the uniqueness and stability of instinct, to no longer be a multiform and unstable whole, simply to be deliberate to one's dominant passion. Become an ant, a cicada, a lion, a fox. Where Ovid, says Serres, described the process of metamorphosis, the fable presents the stabilized result. Perhaps this is what the fables are about, the possibility of devoting ourselves to a single passion that defines our powers and our weakness. What each animal brings to the stage is this very possibility, embodying a power through the body, even if it puts us at risk or turn out to be the cause of loss, like the crow with a piece of cheese, the hare in a race, the dog who lost freedom, or many animals in the fables risking or losing their lives. And perhaps this is indeed the lesson, not so much moral as ethological. Each power carries its risk. If metamorphosis is triggered, it also warns us of the dangers. Becoming human might reside in this lesson, not to cling to a single metamorphosis, but to experiment with and multiply them, to resist the temptation of stability and to understand the dangers involved for each. In this perspective, the fables would then be more ethological than moral. And they would be all the more so. I will here draw inspiration from Deleuze reading reading Spinoza, in that they put to the test the enigma of the body, the fact that we, I quote Deleuze, quoting Spinoza, we do not even know what a body can do. Deleuze repeatedly emphasized this phrase, and within this perspective, we find an ethological outlook that, I quote here Kai Novak, entails a double definition of the body through both a kinetic proposition, motion, and a dynamic proposition, affect. Affect being here conceptualized as forces that augment or diminish the capacity of the body to act. The fables would therefore seem to be more ethological than moral, and so insofar as even true morality is never absent, but one could then consider the moral conclusion as a warning of the risk of metamorphic experimentation, they put to the test powers that will activate and traverse the bodies of those who learn them by heart and by body, of those who will perform the fables. By saying that the fables are ethological, I refer here to the fascinating definition that Deleuze proposed for ethology. As he stated in his course on Spinoza, it is, says Deleuze, ethology is the practical science, and it insisted on practical science of ways of being. The way of a robin, the way a tick or a cow exist. What ethologists study, he clarified, is not what animals are, is not the essence due to the specific belonging, which is what taxonomy will do, shifting modern knowledge, but what animals are capable of. That is a way of being, that is, a way of being is always a repertoire of powers, a repertoire of what animals are capable of. These are the powers, that is to say, more precisely still, what they are able to be affected by and the powers they have to affect. What is the power of the crow? What is weakness? When fox asked to crow to make his beautiful voice heard, one immediately sees the trap. Crows are actually considered to have a rather unpleasant song from a human perspective. But within this fable, there seems to be, I would consider, I'm not with Serres here, but maybe you would agree, we don't know. But within this fable, it seems for me to be a strong intuition at play. Raven and crows have the reputation for being very concerned with the prestige. They are eager to show what they are capable of. They have, Bernard Rich studied that very well. They have often been observed playing very dangerous games, such as nipping at the tail of a sleeping wolf, rushing straight down in flight and then pulling up at the last moment a la James Dean. They hang upside down from electrical cables, swinging back and forth. Isn't that what Fox is counting on? Is it what Fox is counting on? Show me, show what you can do. The irresistible desire of the crow to demonstrate itself, to show off. And doesn't the fact of wanting to make it speak actually reveal a skill long recognized in crows and ravens, the ability to imitate human sounds? Who knows if what I'm claiming about this intrusion is true, but what the fox makes the crow do turns one of its power into a weakness. But we can go further, because once we describe them in terms of powers, we see that the living beings no longer distribute themselves according to the traditional order of category or taxonomy. I quote Deleuze here. These are greater differences between a drafter workhorse and a racehorse than between an ox and a draft horse. This is because, Deleuze continues, the racehorse and the draft horse do not have the same affect or the same power to be affected. Rather, the draft horse has affect in common with the ox. It seems to me that this is at the heart of the metamorphosis that the fables activate. They shake up taxonomies, they blur identities. Who is an animal? Who is a human? What makes one be such an animal or another? In what kind of relationship? What type of affect is mobilized? Also knowing that asking the question of what affects and what can be affected also raises the question of what does not affect. By what is a certain being unaffected? And this is another risk of metamorphosis. Many of the fables can testify to this. One doesn't see, one doesn't understand what the other means or plans. If the vocation of the fables is moral, they also point out to ethics. Ethics, according to Deleuze's reading of Spinoza, is about, I quote Deleuze, understanding how things enter into relationship in the environment where the creation of good relationship enables them to maintain decomposition, while those that are bad lead to decomposition. Metamorphoses are trials through which humans become humans by multiplying the ways of being other and the ways of relating to others, and by learning from them the risk each one presents, as well as the danger of fixating on only one. The human body, Serres writes, can do anything. It carries within it the capacity of species, capable of all bees. It capitalizes on totem. And Serres explained that the body is a root totality. He also say, and from this root totality, I quote, we extract, abstract, choose at will, to become at will, lion, midge, loving pigeon, grumpy bear, stubborn donkey, enthusiastic fox. And he ends by saying, all we have to do is dance. And it will be my last word. And the ant would tell us also, all we need to do is dance. Thank you for your patience. Okay, I give an answer, and after that you find a question. Thank you, Erika. You save everyone.
I mean, thank you very much. That was a fantastic paper. I'm going to be cynical. I apologize. I don't want to be, but I'm going to be. So the idea that there is this disappearing sense of the human, and it's there, the correspondences that Foucault tracks and the analogies and so on, is sitting in the position we are in now, which is after Descartes, in the Anthropocene or the Capitalocene, and wanting to go back to reclaim a world in which correspondences exist, having had Darwin with that idea that there's a web of, I can't remember what the phrase is. It's the web of, somebody help me. Anyway, it's a web of correspondences or something like that. Is the idea that we go back and focus on that as our better way of being nostalgic?
Okay, first I would say that I don't know. And after that, I will try to escape to this not knowing. The first thing I would say that, a lot of people today say, I mean, most of my friends are in it's that way, but it's more complicated that maybe animism will save us, And some, Estelle Zong-Mengal was thinking that maybe analogist was maybe something that was still staying in us. And I would answer that way, that we find some, in the fables, can find some form of creative analogy. And I think that Serres touched that pretty well. And, the correspondence of Foucault was so well done. That analogical toe, let me a minute, because I had an idea and I've lost it. Why should we be analogic? maybe I should take another way, another path, because I really forgot the idea that I had. And maybe we try to, okay, I see. Announcing in the field guide for patchy Anthropocene. I think that's a very great idea of a work, announcing, and it was already in the show. Is that we have to find some patches of Holocene that still are here, concretely. And we have to work with these patches, and I love the word patches. Maybe we still have patches of analogies. And maybe if the fables are so precious for us today, and that's because we feel, maybe we are not being analogists. Maybe, but we find something that is in the order of some familiarity with what we have been, and that maybe as a patchy of Holocene stay in us, in our body, and so on, or maybe not at all. But we feel that in some senses, there would be not a solution, but I would say a relief of what we are. And maybe the fables offer us a relief of what we became. Suzanne says yesterday something very interesting about the difficulty she had with children and young people today. That they didn't have any history. We are, no past, no future. And I was remember that Lévi-Strauss wrote about cold society and hot society, or two-story society. So it is what he showed in a very, very interesting paper that has been hotly contested, but he explained later on. And he says that society are not by themselves cold or hot, because they escape history, they seem not to have a story. They just make them after the nothing changed. And hot society was full of actors and women and so on. And you say, no, hot society, there was no hot society in the course of the Some society become cold and some society become hot. Some society that are considered as cold become very hot when the people, it was contest the fact that being dispossessed from the land. And this history will come back, running. And our societies, you see, are getting very, very, very cold. And I think the coldness is not only because no past and no future, but maybe some fables are giving a little link to the idea that we have a past. And that in some ways we are in the earth of this past. And that our body is inheriting this past and so on and so on. But maybe, it's very disorder and messed up, but it's maybe analogy, it's not a solution, but maybe we can feel a little bit of relief because of that. Because maybe it's a familiarity with something that we inherit, or maybe because it gives us all the kind of connection, that causality, determinism, and so on. So I love analogy. I love analogies.
It's a web of affinities.
There's a web of affinities, yes. And Darwin was older. I read Darwin later. And I didn't realize how much Darwin was always thinking about interdependencies and web of affinity. And I don't know why didn't I see that when I went down 30 years ago. Probably because exactly for that. Thank you.
You're going to cross the stage.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Oh, I should. I will repeat everything again.
We have time for one more question, and it has been claimed.
Is it?
Yeah, it's you.
I'm trying to one.
So
I'll try. Something that I find very inspirational and generative in your work is a determination to see animals as much more than one thing. So they're many things. And something that also seems generative in the Latour characterization of the fable as about metamorphosis rather than about anthropomorphism
Yeah.
is that it opens up a gesture to animals being many things rather than one thing. And so that this poses a problem for me about one of the characterizations of the fable that you mentioned, which is the short bit, short stories, because they do seem to tend towards singularizing something about the animal, that in the story, the animal is something, but it's an essence of something. But like in the Deleuze example, yes, it's wonderful that we think of the horse in terms of affect, but we think of it in terms of one kind of affect. It's draft horseness. How
Then
do you see?
time rolls around? Horses don't care whether they're racehorses
Yeah.
or draft horses. They're interested in each other.
So my question is do you see something positively plural in the fable?
You know, I should say that I do not nothing about fables. And because Kaori asked me to take seriously the word fables, that I decided to work the hardest I could to read La Fontaine fables first, and to read Serres, and after that to go where Serres was leading me.
Yep.
I think that his idea that fables stabilize, each character stabilize, it's a good, I would feel like a good intuition. They put animals in the essence,
Yeah.
but the multiplicity of the situation they are involved in, and the fact that they come back in fables in different way, the wolves being starving with the dog, being accusing and tyrannic with the lamb, and so on and so on and so on, and the goats, come back and so on. So this is it essence, or is it, when Deleuze says powers, it's not about multiplicity.
Yeah.
It's not essence. It's something that can be transformed, that it's in relation. What is important? Essence are not in relationship. Essence is by yourself, the animal themselves. Your essence is what you are because your species is that and your genetic is that, whatever. The powers is always in relation to a milieu,
Yeah.
to other animals. Even, Deleuze says a moment, it's really funny. The regime, this is a power. This is a way of being. The regime, what a cow eat, this is a regime. If you take Deleuze and you cross with Scott Gilbert, the biologist, or with Lynn Margulis, you see that the power of the cows, which is an animal that can digest grass, without bacteria, there is no cow, there is no grass, there is nothing. And I think that, you see,
Yeah.
this is where essence and powers or ways of being are in contrast, but the contrast is very slight, as you see. And if I would take Serres says always that the preposition is one of the way is expressed in the fables, the fact that each are in relation. The wolf is, in that case, because he's with the dog.
Yeah.
And is in another case when it's with the lamb, and it's another power that is activated. But in the same time, what Serres say, and I think it's interesting, that this metamorphosis, being one animal, is very, very dangerous, because each power probably could be a weakness. Not each power, but you don't have any. Serres insists that in a lot of fables they are murder. One is killed.
Thank you.